Well, today I am so lucky because I am joined by Kathy from Children England, which is
Hi.
very exciting. Hi.
Hi.
So good to have you on the podcast because there's just so much going on. And I don't even know really where to start in our kind of 35 to 40-minute segment because you just do so much at Children England. And you are, in fact, Kathy Evans, CEO of Children England, are you not?
I am.
So let's just learn a little bit about. No, actually, let's not learn a little bit about Children England first. I want to know how you got here, how you arrived, as really, in the time I've got to know you, you are a true activist, really, for young people and children. So, you know, it's no surprise, of course, that you've ended up in the job that you're in. But what's your motivator? How did you get here? Who is Kathy Evans?
Wow. I spent now a scary 30. I went to my university reunion, 30 years reunion, last weekend, which is a scary number in itself. But pretty much as soon as I left university, I volunteered for a children's home, for a charity children's home, and I did full-time volunteering and trained in the basics of community work with children. And there was one young man that I mean, there were lots of ways in which working at a children's home was inspiring and very different from my preconceptions, and something that I found myself strangely drawn to. I'll put it that way. This was the beginning. It wasn't that I thought this is my thing, but there was one boy at that unit who basically just set my career path. He was, his force for life was just completely compulsive, and it didn't matter what I knew he'd been through. He was so in love with being alive that it was something you just had to follow. And so I kind of followed him. He was considered a naughty kid. He ended up getting kicked out of that children's home. I moved on to work in secure units, to work with what I would call the more interesting and certainly naughtier young people. But and that was a hugely significant job for me. But he had been, the fact that I found him so magnetic as a personality was part of the reason that I went to work with other boys who were considered trouble. And so I worked there for many years. I trained as a counsellor. And then I left that, went into policy work because I wanted to get upstream of the number of boys who were coming into that unit who really didn't need to be there if earlier systems and earlier professionals had not just chosen to put them at arm's length. So I went into policy work, and that was in the drug sector, and it was always with the intention of getting back to practice. Well, I'll just go and sort out the youth justice system and then get back. You know, naive, beautifully naive 20-something. And so I've been in policy work ever since. I didn't know that you could do policy work when I studied policy at university, but being paid to write and argue with people still makes me laugh how ridiculously easy that is for me. I would be doing it anyway, and I get paid to do it. So I've actually stuck with policy work ever since. And so from Drug Scope to the Children's Society, and then to Children England.
And I wonder if there's a frustration about that, because I think lots of us come into the system to kind of do something about it. You know, we have a passion to either do something about it on a macro level or on a relationship level with individual young people, or a mix of both, or whatever it is. And I'm wondering, when you go into doing policy, how frustrating it feels, or does it? You know, because you're part of that space. You know, it's very tempting for people to think, oh, nothing's changed. And there are lots of things that haven't changed. There really are. But actually, in terms of policy, I'm wondering, have there been quite a lot of changes? Because from where I'm sitting, Whether they translate into the correct action or not is always interesting. But from where I'm sitting, there have been policy changes. I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, do you feel that too?
I do feel that, and I feel the opposite simultaneously. So I'm routinely frustrated by how many of the issues we have to keep trying to plug away at are the same, but on a cycle. So, you know, if I thought when I started out 30 years ago that we'd still be trying to make the case for earlier intervention, I think I might have pulled my hair out then. But we've been through various cycles of winning the case and then getting the investment and then needing to remake the case. You know, but there's also what I realized about 2.5 years after going into policy work from practice was that I was really struggling to understand what my job was and what my satisfaction could be derived from, because when you're working with children and young people, whether you have a good day or a bad day, you know it at the end of the day. You know, your job is to be present as a person in a relationship with those young people, and to bring yourself to what happens in the events of the day, the conversations of the day. And so even if you might go home, I used to go home often at the end of the day and go, God, I don't really know whether I was useful today. But at least you had been there and you could reflect on those things. And if you thought that you needed to do better in certain circumstances, you could think about it next day. In policy work, you know, there are things that I've been campaigning on for like 5 years, 10 years. We still never got there. For every campaign that I've been involved in that's been successful, of which I'm hugely proud, and is very rarely ever a sole achievement. So there's teamwork, there's coalition building, there's a lot of slog to getting change. But I know what that feels like. But to set against that, you have to be ready to lose a lot or to win and keep plugging.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you have a view on whether we're actually going backwards currently, because that's what it feels like for me, is that there have been, and you're right, there is a cycle, and we've been around about the same amount of time in this work, if in very different spaces in this work. And you know, sometimes I have felt, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, that we sort of stopped, but then it wasn't 2 steps back, 1 step forward. I'm thinking, I just think, I wonder if we're just going backwards. I'm not feeling very positive and hopeful about where we're at currently, and I can't really see an end to it. There will be an end to it because that's how this works, although we are very different people than the people who entered into the 21st century, for example. Local authorities are very different. Politics is very different. We're in a very, very different space. I mean, I know that's about 14 different statements in one paragraph, which is why you're now note taking. But you know, what do you see? How do you see that? How do you see that on the ground?
A couple of years ago, when I spoke to my members at our AGM, I did say that I felt that for the first time in my adult life, in my career, I felt like we needed to restate the case for childhood,
yes,
as being something that society must treat specially.
Yes.
And I do think that I've been struggling in all of the campaigning, in all of the training, in all of the practice that I've been involved with till fairly recently. Even if people had different opinions about what is the right way to nurture a child or to educate a child or to manage these social policy problems that involve children, I'd never really encountered a kind of a fundamental disregard of the idea that a child is someone not entitled to be punished for being inadequate in some way, or that they are not meant to yet be held to kind of the pressures and the accountabilities to which we hold all adults. So So I think I've realised we need to restate that case, but not because everyone's forgotten it. I don't encounter that. I do generally, in the general public, I encounter the public understanding that when austerity reaches children, that's not right. That when, you know, a child bearing all of the sins of their father is not right. I still think that's a natural position for most human beings to take, but in social policy, I think we've lost that. Having said that, I do see various dimensions of the world that children are now growing up in, and the role that they're playing in it, which to me are vastly advanced on my experience of childhood, my era of childhood. And so in particular, I think, you know, we have moved a long way towards children's voice and participation in all sorts of dimensions of life where that was not accepted before. And within systems, within schools. I went to a great comprehensive school, but we didn't have a school council. We weren't encouraged to think that we had a say. I see some I see some schools and some kind of approaches to children, young people, and their status and their agency that knocks spots off anything that I ever saw when I was a teenager. But I think we've got some polarizing going on. So I've seen schools that make me cry with beauty at how they approach their children, the inclusiveness involving SEN and disability, multiple different languages, migrant children, and making it a joyous experience. I've never seen anything like that. But then we have on the other polar opposite, we have the encouragement of rote learning, silent corridors, isolation booths, tough, zero tolerance towards any misbehaviour that sound more draconian than my mum's description of a 1940s grammar school. And you know, so I think we've got sort of juxtaposed advances with some very, very strange retro kind of almost nostalgia for days when children weren't nearly as full people as we'd like them to be.
I mean, that's my experience very much as well. As you know, I work in a lot of schools and I see that polarisation. And it begs the question to me often about, does our society and culture actually like children? And, you know, you've kind of half answered that by going back to an era where this fantasy that it was really lovely when children were seen and not heard, which is very, very much a Victorian kind of sense of children. And I'm just, you know, sometimes I have to ask myself the question, do people actually even like children in this country? Because there are countries that are very in Europe, oh God, I said the E word, in Europe, we're not going there, you know, that are very embracing and inclusive of children and like children and enjoy children, and all their systems demonstrate that through their actions of those systems. Yeah. We really don't have that kind of culture here, and I guess that's part of what, you know, why having agency is just so important, and having that participation and the work of Children England. But I'm going to move us off there, because I think we are yet another podcast where we could talk for a very long time, and I do not want to let you go without a couple of things that I'm interested in exploring with you. One of those is the commissioning conversation. And I want to draw you into the commissioning conversation because it's become quite a big, divisive Twitter space that has become quite personal. And the arguments around commissioning and what that actually means are incredibly valid, but there's an anger sitting underneath that that means that it's very difficult to get into a more nuanced conversation about the current world we're living in and how we best meet needs of children. And I've seen you a couple of times pop into those, and I know that you chair the commissioning conference. So while you're here, I thought I would ask you for some views on that. I'd draw you into that space, if that's okay.
Well, so I don't know where to start. Children England we've had to address commissioning, and I should emphasise, commissioning affects every part of public sector and charitable sector service provision. It's not just what happens in the care system, and so we've before my time as chief executive, we were already doing research and also supporting our members who are all charities to understand the commissioning practices that we're developing around them. We had a fairly clear and simple preference for seeing any charity do better than a private company in any commissioning environment, and we would still stand by that, just as the most basic. But looking at some of the systemic problems in what happens and who gets money and who gets services on what terms when we call things a market. And we should probably say there are certainly some commissioners that I've come across who say they're commissioners but who don't believe that they're running a market. And it is possible, it used to be possible to do that. So I entered into the space of becoming increasingly concerned and whole system analytical about the commissioning environment and public marketplace, because it was ruining our sector. It was first and foremost, it was damaging the sense of common cause that should exist between any charity and any public sector body that has a care or concern for children, and it introduces all sorts of terrible forces of self-interest in terms of growth, in terms of wanting to compete and hold information from each other if it would help us in a marketplace. So all of those forces I could just see, sort of like in a virtual iceberg, we're going to bring the whole thing down. And that I think is particularly our concern for the care system. We started out by going back to our roots in residential care, because Children England was started in 1942 as the constituent societies of children of national children's homes. So we were charities who were running children's homes, got together to make sure that children's homes were sufficiently represented in the emerging welfare state that was going to come in the middle of the once the peace had been achieved. So our roots were in residential care, and we came to 2014 or 2013 it was that we did the work where he said, hold on a minute, this so-called market for residential care, we were at least 70% of all the provision, and then there was public sector. Over the last 70 odd years, we've ended up with 75% private sector, 2% charity, and a shrinking proportion public sector. How did that happen? Because the truth is, nobody decided to make that happen. It happened by a terrible sort of because it's happening over there, because the NHS has got an internal market, and because councils have to go out to compulsory tender. Let's just try a bit of compulsory tendering, competitive tendering in residential care. They did community care in the community for adults. So let's do some of that. Let's see if we can sharpen things up. And it was completely chaotic. It's not framed to be a market. It's not meant to be a market. It's not got no market regulation. And in that absence of oversight, absence of regulation, it's become a bit of a private sector free-for-all. But that's because charities pulled out and public sector stopped investing. Yeah. So I think this is there's nothing about the current care commissioning system that I think is where anyone would ideally want to be, and it's certainly not how anyone would ideally want to be trying to make care arrangements. But the fact that we end up here is a completely collective, systemic problem. And I think it's deeply problematic to point to individuals within that system and hold them accountable as if others aren't. Everyone has been caught in a collective system which we need to change urgently. And, you know, Children England has come up with some ideas. We've been saying we want the debate. We don't necessarily think they're the final answer, but we have to talk about how to rearrange the decision making, the power structure, how to put children in a position of power in this system about what they want, not what the market can sustain, not what the geography can dictate. You know, there are so many problems in this system that we have to change, and I find universal agreement about that, whoever I speak to, including within the private sector and including among local authority commissioners. And I got asked to chair that contentious annual Children's Commissioning Conference. I'd done it this year and last year, after basically reading the Riot Act to the entire conference 3 years ago, about saying, will you stop playing around with this idea that this is a marketplace? Because if you don't, it's going to come down. It will come down with every child in it. So we have to, you know, without pointing fingers and saying it's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault. My view is that all three sectors it's all of our fault. But it requires national coordinated, decisive action to sort it out. Yeah. Because individual players cannot just drop out and change the whole system.
No, and it's just not mutually capable. You know, it can't meet the interests of vulnerable young people while commodifying child protection. You can't commodify child protection. It's deplorable. And I think you're right. I really do. But that leads us then to a kind of, you know, like my conspiracy theory head is like, isn't it interesting? Because if we starve local authorities, then they have to be at the business of managing that starvation. If people are hungry, then they have to deal with those survival needs, and that's the macro level, mirroring very much what's happened for vulnerable people under austerity. The macro level of that is how local authorities are trying to survive in the climate of some being very starved. I mean, I live in a bankrupt local authority, and they, as far as I can make out, every headline about them is that they've been quite corrupt as well. So this is hugely problematic. So, I mean, I haven't lived in this local authority long enough to know a lot about it. It's a Tory-run area, and it seems they've spent a lot of their money not on the things they're supposed to. But I don't think that's the case for all local authorities. I think local authorities have been starved and then beaten for not providing. That's the national kind of language. So in your kind of systemic overview, which makes a lot of sense to me, how do you envisage that? I mean, are you involved with the LGA and things like that? You know, how do you kind of make those connections and links and come up with something that does have that very national kind of, you know, opportunity?
So there were two things. So I completely agree that I mean, I think the financial onslaught on councils since 2010, due to end up in zero grants from Whitehall in 2020, by design, reinforced in 2015 by the Comprehensive Spending Review, is absolute. I mean, I remember gasping when I saw it in 2015. Immediately after, there was a complete unity from all councils, Tory, Labour, Lib Dem. They all wrote to George Osborne and said, if you keep doing these cuts, people will die. And I remember the line from it, and them not only completely failing to recognise that was true, and it must be true if every party had got together and said, absolutely, don't do this. But it was not only true, it didn't make them flinch. It didn't even make them stop for a moment. They still planned to take revenue support grant from what was around about 30% cut then, at that point, average, to 100% cut by 2020. That remains the current plan. And I remember just gasping in horror that this is being announced, and also nobody is talking about it.
But what I would say is that 2015 and 2016 are two very different spaces. And what we have now is actually a proper opportunity for cross-party politics when it comes to vulnerability, because there are members of parties that perhaps, look, let's say it how it is. The Tory party, like you say, has not shown any kind of action that suggests it likes children, it likes vulnerable people, it wants to support them. But there are individuals within that party that are starting to say, hang on a minute, this is not what they call compassionate conservatism. This is not what we're about. And because since we've had the whole, Brexit vote, which has taken politics out of two main parties having two very clear fixed ideas about things, to a kind of opportunity for cross-party. This is an opportunity, surely, that we can galvanise.
Well, I don't know about. So I have to emphasise. I work for a charity representing charities. So we've always tried to work cross-party, and that was why we welcomed that recognition from LGA's members, that this was a cross-party problem. And so when we raised alarm about it and ended up, trying to kind of get agreement that this was a devastating proposition for children who rely on that revenue support grant, it became very clear to me that very few people understood how local government finance works for children, and particularly not for children in care. And that was a cross-party, that was a cross-politic, that was a cross-position. There were plenty of senior managers in children's services who didn't understand the up above finance. They got what they got from their council in terms of their budget, and most of them were trying valiantly to keep them as high as possible. But the impact of what Whitehall was doing year on year to their council didn't necessarily add up for many within the children's sector as well. So we ended up working out that we needed to do some awareness raising about the nature of the financial onslaught and what it meant for the funding of child protection post 2020. So when we came to the 2017 general election, that's when we did our Balloons of Doom campaign to explain that if you that the evidence is very clear. The more economically deprived an area, the higher their demand for social care for children, families and adults, and that those councils faced being left to meet that social care demand purely on business rates and council tax, which, if they're economically depressed, they will have less income from. So that it's a double whammy.
I didn't mean to laugh at balloons. No. It just sounded so.
We had to try and make it comprehensible that this was a sort of things that I don't even believe necessarily that Cameron and George Osborne had sat there and said, what does this mean for child protection budgets? Oh yeah, let's do it. I think it completely went below the radar. And so we needed to do some awareness raising that was what it meant for children's social care. And once we'd done that, then we could build some really, we've got our Children Act funding formula proposition, because the bottom line is, which we co-produced with lots of people, with Paul Bywaters and June Thoburn and Jane Tunstall, and all sorts of people who remain, and it wasn't us telling them they had to be. There is still such support for the principles and the aspirations and the vision of the Children Act 1989. As properly understood. It already was intended to keep families together, to invest in whatever it takes for all the members of a family to do well, or to navigate a blip in their pathway without being pathologized, without being assessed as risk, that it gave automatic and unconditional duties to disabled children and their families. You know, the stuff that's in the Children Act that is simply falling by the wayside because it's not funded is heartbreaking. But we wanted to say, keep the Children Act, just design a funding system to match it, because you cannot expect any local council to just be able to find the money out of somewhere. The Children Act is gold standard legislation. It requires us to invest in every single child and to redistribute money from our income taxes, which go to the Treasury, back out to the local area, which can invest them properly. So we have a Children Act funding formula. We're still campaigning on it. The chair of the Education Select Committee is very supportive of it. It's got sign up and support from anyone who cares, and that's how we like to do it, is to make the issue so clear that it's not partisan.
I think it's genius.
Yeah,
I think it's genius, and I think quite alarming for people to recognise that how many people don't understand actually what it all means, because there is from those of us that wander about in despair, you know, as much as I am reflective and I like to, you know, read around everything, there's a part of me that thinks, are people actually sat in a room coming up with this stuff because they literally don't like children? And so, of course, what you're saying is no. And I don't know if this is worse, but potentially because they haven't really thought about it. Is that worse? I mean, I don't know. Is that worse than doing just an act of deliberate, of something deliberately? Go on.
Well, I think it's a problem. You're right. It's not a situation where we should be kind of reassured. If it's true that national policy making just doesn't forget, it just routinely forgets about children. But so this is part of the reason why, you know, we've got these cumulative concerns. I can't make our fear and our alarm at the financial onslaught on councils any less kind of pressing. We have two different solutions to that. We've got a systemic redesign for the care commissioning and financing system, which would create a care bank to fund each child for whatever care they need nationally, and then that makes the providers meet those children's needs rather than their care commissioners' needs. And we've got the Children Act funding formula for councils. We will pitch those to anyone who will listen. We recently did a lot of getting it through to the Select Committee for Housing and Local Communities and Local Government. But we also need to move on. And I don't mean move on as in drop those. We have the answers. I'm not going to keep messing around. Sign up, support. One day they'll come. But we have, for our 75th birthday, and you know, we sat down and said, should we even still be here? And we thought that welfare state that we were part of trying to create a great national effort to mark the peace after the war by creating a welfare state that worked for everyone. We kind of had a look at it and said it's not really working anymore. So you know, it's not working for too many people. You know, and that's not because the people who work in it are malintended. It is because we just kept grinding away at it with different kinds of reform and different kinds of cuts and nudge ideas and incentivizations and, you know, academies and all sorts of different embroideries on the idea, which has ended up with a housing system that makes people homeless, a benefit system that makes people destitute to punish them. We have, you know, schools that make too many children feel like a failure before they've even had a chance to succeed. And we have an NHS, which still too often is about drawing all attention to dysfunction and conditions and not enough on actual positive health. So, you know, so we've got some systems to change while wanting to keep hold of the original purpose. We don't want to just say we can't afford a welfare state anymore. That's so passé. That means disaster for children, absolute disaster for children. But what we want to do is go back to Maslow and say we know that what universal human needs are or a healthy upbringing, and then they continue to be your universal needs as you go through adulthood. So if all of those branches of the welfare state could assure for every child that they have a home, safety and security, love and belonging, health, and a sense of purpose, and that's what their parents are encouraged to have, and to hold on to, and to share with their children and to offer to their children. We think that both simplifies rather than adds to the complexity of the public realm, and what we're all paying into, but also that if we can create those conditions for children throughout our society, then it will be a better place for everyone.
In our lifetime, do you think, Kathy?
Well, let's have a talk about that. I mean, this has to be the reason that we're doing this as a reframing of the welfare state, and the reason that we are launching a hunt to find the young people who are going to do that redesign is because it's a generational proposition.
Tell me that again. So tell me, what have you're going to tell me all about that? Because that's sounds like the next big piece of work.
Welfare state next gen.
Yes.
Yes. Well, we've been doing lots of talking around the housing system, the welfare, the health system, lots of different areas, and people who are trying to lead change this last year. Inspiring enough for us to make sure that we thought we were onto something here. And so we recently got funding from the Esme Fairbairn Foundation to support us to create a young people's leadership program. So we want to find at least 25 young people from England around the country, from different parts of the country, rural, urban, suburban. We want different kinds of communities, different kinds of experience of the public sector, children who've got experience of hospitals, whatever their experience of schools, or living in housing associations, or different kinds of housing. We want young people who are up for this, and we will train them in research methods and policy formation, etc. And they're going to be a core team of 25 young people who will design and deliver a program to reach at least 2,500 young people, children, young people, and young adults. And that's about taking the principles of the welfare state, what they should aim to do, and then young people telling us how you make it better.
I love it. It ticks every box.
Yeah, it does. And so I'm not one of those who wants to wipe my hands and say hand over to the young people. This is about bringing lack of baggage, lack of cynicism, lack of jaded, and just being part of making the better system that we should have for the future. So whenever we get through this crisis of effective government, and somebody, whoever it is, whatever party or no party at all, realizes that there's some serious work to be done about rewiring the societal infrastructure of this country, there'll be some ideas ready to go and some people really ready to do it.
Brilliant. Well, I don't know what to say. What a great conversation, and so much stuff in there. And, it's just so fantastic to know that you're there, that you're doing that you're doing all that policy work. And I absolutely love the latest piece of work that you're going to be doing with young people's leadership, because, it's we're getting on a little bit, aren't we?
That's right.
Still got a lot to go, but at the end of the day, we have to be working properly, cross-generationally, properly, not the piecemeal. And
if I can just say, I think we have so much reason to be thrilled and inspired by the young activists in the young generation now. And so we're seeing young people like Greta Thunberg and all of our young people who are trying to strike a completely different tone and a completely different kind of agency on environmental and climate crisis. That is, to me, the most political thing I've seen in my life, and it's completely without party. It is simply, we must change. And that's part of, one of my great sources of hope and faith at the moment is the generation that I see coming through, in their teens and their 20s now, and the kind of activism that they're leading blows my mind. So we need more of that.
We need a whole lot more of that. Kathy, it's been absolutely fantastic speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too, Lisa.